how much planning goes into one of your books? Please, for God's sake, don't tell me you just sit down and write them on a whim.
I do no planning whatsoever. For one fundamental reason, which is that, and all writers do it differently. Everybody has a different method. Ask 10 writers, you'll get 11 methods. And some of them do extensive outlining. Some of them do 100-page synopses or 200-page that then turn into a book. Some of them have index cards with every scene on it. They pin it up, they shuffle the order. I feel that if I did that, to me the fascination is telling the story. And if I'd done that, then I would have told the story. It would be clear in my head and it would be over. And then the actual process of typing out the book would be very boring, and boring for me. And I think my boredom would show through, and it wouldn't be a good book. So usually I just start somewhere, and I just keep on going. And every paragraph essentially is, all right, what could happen now? What's going to happen next? So it is all completely arbitrary, made up on the spur of the moment, and that makes a better book, I think. That if there's a problem, you keep it there and you solve it.
I hope that there's an enormous amount of research goes into it for those very reasons. You have to get it right.
I've got two answers to the research question, and one is very flippant, and the other is very pretentious. The flippant answer is I don't do any research, and I really don't. I don't do any research in the sense that I go to the library with a notebook. I don't visit a location with a camera. I don't do any of that stuff. The pretentious answer is that a writer's whole life is research. That everything you ever see or do, any movie you ever see, any book you ever read, any person you ever talk to, anything at all, is liable to come back and be useful at some point. And I've got the kind of mind that I love trivial stuff. I love facts. I love knowing things. And practically everything that's in my book is something that I will have found out years before in a completely different context, and then I use later. I just love trivial and interesting information. And the thing about research is that they're just as likely to complain about the true things as the made-up things. My first book, for instance, Killing Floor, is set in Georgia, and in a small town, and it basically concerns counterfeiting. And everything in that book was made up, apart from the counterfeiting. I had never been to Georgia. In fact, still have never been to Georgia. It was all totally made up, apart from the counterfeiting, which is absolutely true, because I wrote it in the summer of 1995, when the US got a new $100 bill. And they got a new $100 bill because the old one was so easy to counterfeit, and it was becoming a major problem worldwide. And because, you know what happens when you get a new piece of currency or something changes, there's a lot of journalistic coverage of it. And so there was a lot of stuff in the press, including a huge, long article in the New Yorker magazine, which is notoriously well fact-checked. If there's something in the New Yorker, you can be pretty sure it's absolutely accurate. And it was a big, in-depth article that was basically the whole history of counterfeiting, and also an economic analysis of the dangers of counterfeit money, all that kind of stuff. And that's where I took everything about counterfeiting, and I'm sure it's true. And yet the most common comment I get about that book is, I loved that book until we got to the counterfeiting, which was all bullshit. That's not how they do it. So it's one of those things where you can never be right enough to, and so that makes you relaxed about research. They're going to be on your case, whatever, and so why do any, basically?
Could we go back to that first book? What was it? I mean, the first book's the first. Previous to that, you're not a novelist.
Right.
You were working in TV,
yeah.
You said. What made you want to write the novel? Was it a dream you'd always had?
Actually, no. I was I'm very untypical as a writer, because, most people have wanted to be a writer for a certain amount of time. There's a lot of people who've got novels that they wrote when they were 7 years old, put in a drawer. A friend of mine jokes that he wanted to be a novelist ever since he was a fetus. I never wanted to be a writer, and in many ways I still don't want to be a writer. I was very happy in television, and I was fired. That was the problem. I was fired after 18 years, and the final 2 years of it I had also been the shop steward, fighting against the closure of our station. And so I was unemployable in the industry, basically, because I'd been a union man. And so I literally had no choice. It wasn't that I could take another TV job. It was that the only other job at the time available was a warehouse man. So it was either be a warehouse man or try something else. And I'd been a big reader all my life. And what happens with me is if I enjoy consuming something, then I automatically want to do it. I wanted to be in the Beatles. I wanted to play soccer for Aston Villa. Whatever I love, I want to be doing it. So I'd been reading all along with this vague notion, this would be pretty cool to do. But I came to it pretty late, actually. I'd consumed books ever since I was 3 or 4 years old. And it wasn't until I was probably in my middle 30s before I started to really think, well, where do they come from? I had no concept of the production of them. I just thought they were there. And so then I thought, well, maybe I could do this, maybe. I figured I've read some, how hard can it be? So I thought that was what I was going to do.
And so how different was your first run at Reacher from what became Killing Floor in the end? Was it a matter of sitting down and bang, you've got a Jack Reacher novel, the first one, 12 months later on, or was it, kind of tortuous?
It was more tortuous than it is now. Obviously the more often you do it, the better at it you get. And not so much the better at it you get, because I'm not actually sure that you'd get any better at it. You become more tuned into what's going to be acceptable, because you've worked with an editor for a number of years, and it's almost unspoken. You know what they want, they know what you can do, and it becomes easy to do. But the first book, it's just a step in the dark. And there were two things that fundamentally altered between the first draft of Killing Floor and the final book, and they were basically the whole story, and secondly, the length. Because I started Killing Floor, I said I don't make plans, and I don't, but with Killing Floor I had a visual image in mind, which was a warehouse full of cash money. And so it was a question of getting there and then doing something with it. And the original story of Killing Floor was actually about drug money, because that was something that interested me at the time. I bought a non-fiction book, again fairly randomly, simply because it had a great jacket. It was a laminated jacket, and underneath the plastic lamination was a real dollar bill. And it was about money laundering. It was really a fairly technical non-fiction book about money laundering. And it was full of fascinating stuff about the extent of the narcotics trade in America, the enormous amount of money. I mean, a gigantic amount of money. In fact, more money is spent on illegal narcotics in America than on food. An absolute avalanche of money that is actually twice the amount of money that was in circulation. I got kind of fascinated by that, and I had a few dollar bills. I had a 10 and a 5 and a 20 and a few ones and all that lying around in a drawer from the last time I'd been to the States. And my daughter was 15 at the time, and I sent her to weigh them in her chemistry lab at school, because I wanted to know what they weighed. And she came back and told me, and I worked out that the volume of money that was circulating was 4,000 tons of money was being trucked around the country at any one time. And so that is a huge industrial problem. So the initial story of Killing Floor was trucking this drug money south to the Caribbean, and then it gets shipped back by the official banking system, and then it goes back again. And so I had the idea that it was collected in a warehouse, ready for onward transmission down through Florida. So I wrote. So that was the story I wrote, and the publisher who bought it said, "Yeah, we really like the character. We really like your telling style. We like everything about it, except the drug trade is boring. Everybody writes about the drug trade, so change it to something else. So I wanted to keep the idea of this warehouse full of money. So then I got into this counterfeiting thing, and I found out that that twice, once in Colombia, once in Syria, the most effective counterfeiting happens. They take a dollar bill, a single dollar bill, and they bleach it, because the paper is the hard thing to find. The plates are not all that difficult to make. The ink is not all that difficult to get. The paper is very difficult to get. So they were bleaching $1 bills and reprinting them as $100 bills, which works with American money because it's all the same size. And so I changed it to that. And so this warehouse, instead of just being full of like any bills, it was full of $1 bills, because they were on their way, in my story, to Venezuela to be reprinted. So that was change number one, the sort of purpose of the story. And change number two was making it shorter. I'd written a book that was, I thought, I was trying to do a thing whereby there was an implicit bargain between the reader and the character, that the character would account for every minute in the day, make an honest explanation of what was happening all day, every day. And they said, no, that's too long, cut it to the bone. And I did. I cut it, it was about 630 manuscript pages. I cut it down to 475. And that was initially very tough to do. It took me ages to get around to cutting the first word out of it, but then I totally got into it, and I was just macheteing my way through that whole thing like crazy by the end.
You were saying before that you develop with an editor and a publisher over time, and that the Reacher style has evolved a lot more than you would see in other series. It's changed point of view, but also the style of writing is different. One of the things that stands out about Killing Floor is the almost choppy, brutal way that the story is delivered. A lot of the sentences aren't finished, and it puts you inside Reacher's head in a way it's much more effective than a lot of other first-person stories. Was that something that you deliberately set out to do, or was it just you hadn't written a book before and you had no idea what you were doing?
Well, I had no idea what I was doing, except I instinctively understood that. Well, the background to it was, like I said, I was broke, I was out of work, I was angry, I was desperate, I was in a hurry. All of those things were true. But I had an idea that it needed a kind of fingerprint. It needed something that was identifiable and special and different from what other people were doing. And it came to me to do this. And I also conceived Reacher as he's not stupid by any means, but he is somewhat inarticulate. He's not a big talker. In fact, somebody pointed out that the most common line in all 14 of the books is, Reacher said nothing. And so, because it was a first-person narrative, I hit on the idea of that brutal style, a sort of faux naif style in a way, of the short, choppy sentences, a certain amount of repetition, as if it were this rather brusque and inarticulate man being forced to communicate. And I thought, that's going to stand out, that's different. And it did. And over the years I have, I think, as you say, noticeably smoothed that out. It's become, I think the DNA is still there, but it has become a lot more fluent. And I don't know whether that's good or bad, but it's I felt necessary. I think certain things in a series should not change, but other things ought to change a little bit.
Well, one of the huge changes was point of view. Like You start off as first person and you go to third.
Well, the change from first person to third person was, it was a number of different reasons all wrapped up in one. I started with first person because I think that it's the most natural way of telling a story. It's how we all do it. That's how we communicate. We say, I did this, I did that. It produces a very fast and personal bond between the character and the reader. That was why I did it. But I was very aware that you can get stereotyped as a writer, just like you can as an actor or anything else. And so I felt if I did 2 books quite similar, that would kind of close off opportunities for later. So I decided to do the second book as different as I could from the first book, within the constraints that it was the same character. Partly so I wouldn't stereotype myself and become typecast, and to try and stake out, if Killing Floor was kind of the left field, Die Trying would be the right field, and the story was different as well. It was much more glossy, it had the White House in it and the FBI in it and all that kind of stuff. I thought I would stake out 2 limits, and then that would give the territory in between. I could occupy the in-between stuff forever afterward. We read fiction to give us what we don't get in real life. And in a lot of ways, you know, the old French word for novel is roman, meaning a romance, essentially. And in the modern sense of romance, of course, romance is for what we don't get in real life. And the same thing is true, I think, in these action books. You know, you all know what it's like. Some frustrating situation, you know, at the simplest level, if your house gets burgled, they're not going to find the guys, and you're not going to get your stuff back. If your car gets ripped off, it's gone. If somebody disrespects you at work, what do you do about it? Nothing. But in a book, you know, if your house gets burgled, you're damn right you find the guys. You do get your stuff back and you kick their ass. And if somebody disrespects you at work, you come back instantly with the witty response. So that's what books are for, to give us what we can't have.
When I was reading, I think it was Gone Tomorrow over the last couple of days, it was fascinating. Reacher doesn't strike me as a bleeding heart liberal, and yet, you know, when the Patriot Act falls on him in the first half of that book, he doesn't like it very much. And yet, you know, in that way, you know, by the second half of the book, he understands that extreme measures are sometimes necessary.
The ironic thing about that book was that everything that Reacher says of consequence in that book about Iraq was actually real, in as much as that was the 12th book, and over the previous 11 books, a lot of military read them, and they write to me, especially serving military, because the serving military in Iraq and Afghanistan are often bored for long periods of time. You know, they have nothing to do. They can't go anywhere and do anything, so they read a lot, and they're all online, and so they email the author, and we build up a kind of relationship. It can take years to build it up, and it always starts out kind of jokey. You know, because one of the earlier books, it describes Reacher as having had this military police training that enables him to take down Delta Force operatives if necessary. And so all these Delta Force guys from Afghanistan were writing to me saying, you know, we could kick Reacher's ass. And I write back and say, no, you couldn't. He could kick your ass with his head in a bag. And it goes back and forth like this, and then eventually I say, yeah, okay, fine. Of course you could kick Reacher's ass, but you've got to understand I'm trying to make a living here, and it's not a very good commercial thing to say is, this is my main character and he's not very good at anything. But over that time you build up this kind of, especially with soldiers, it's very interesting, you build up this, because they don't know you, you know, they do not know you, and you are never face to face with them. They tell you things more honestly than they would tell anybody else. And they were very unhappy and very dissatisfied a lot of the time. And so for that book, Nothing to Lose, I put their words in Reacher's mouth. And it came out very critical, not of the army. The army's fine. I mean, I think the key phrase that is word for word what some guy actually wrote to me. Reacher says, I loved the army. It's like a sister. It's like my sister who married a creep. That's how people felt about it. And so I put that in Reacher's mouth as part of the story. And of course, yeah, he was immediately seen as this liberal turncoat. And I got a lot of very negative mail from people that were heavily emotionally invested in George Bush. So, you know, Reacher is apolitical in that sense. I hesitate to call him a libertarian because to me that has kind of negative connotations, but he just calls it as he sees it. And the Patriot Act is stupid. You know, it's a completely stupid thing. It was like saying, the rhetoric at the time was, we've been attacked for our freedoms. And so the response was, all right, let's turn ourselves into a third-rate imitation of East Germany. You know, there's no logic in that, no sense. And somebody like Reacher would see that immediately.